In the heart of Savannah, a grieving widow, her wounded German shepherd, and a quiet Navy SEAL crossed paths one stormy night. What began with cruelty turned into an act of courage that changed 3 lives forever. A story of healing, faith, and second chances. Proof that true heroes often walk among us, silently. If this story touched your soul, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel to keep these stories of love and redemption alive. Leave a comment below to tell us where you're watching from. And remember, kindness is the greatest strength of all. The rain had been falling all afternoon over Savannah, a soft, steady drizzle that painted the cobblestone streets in liquid gold beneath the lamps. By nightfall, the air was heavy with the scent of salt and wet magnolia. Inside the Savannah Community Recreation Center, the world was a different rhythm. Fluorescent lights hummed softly, the floors gleamed, and the echoes of laughter from the evening yoga class drifted faintly through the corridors. Grace Miller moved through it all like a ghost who knew the shape of every shadow. She pushed her mop bucket slowly across the tiled hall, the yellow wheels squeaking every few feet. Her blue janitor's uniform clung slightly to her shoulders, damp from the humidity. She wasn't old, 38, but grief had a way of bending time. Her auburn hair was tied back in a loose bun that had come undone near the temples, streaked with the first threads of gray. Her face carried the kind of beauty born not from youth, but from endurance, quiet, tired, and real. At the end of the hall, under the harsh overhead light, a German shepherd waited, Ranger. His tan and black coat had lost some of its shine, and one ear tilted permanently to the side, a remnant of an old injury. He lay curled beside the supply closet, head resting on his paws, eyes flicking to every sound, the clatter of a door, the squeal of sneakers from the gym. The world still frightened him. Grace looked back at him every few moments, her gaze softening. "You okay, boy?" she murmured. Ranger's tail brushed once against the floor, hesitant, as if afraid to hope. They were an odd pair, the janitor and the dog. 3 years ago, Grace had been a trauma nurse at St. Luke's Hospital, fast and sharp, her hands saving lives without hesitation. Then came the fire. Her husband, Mark, a firefighter with the city department, had gone into a burning warehouse to rescue a trapped man. The building collapsed. He didn't come out. After the funeral, the walls of their little house became unbearable. The sound of heart monitors, the smell of antiseptic, everything reminded her of loss. So she quit. Now she cleaned floors that once shimmered beneath her husband's work boots when he taught kids fire safety in this same community center. She told no one. The quiet of night was easier than small talk and sympathy. Dirt, unlike grief, could be erased. She dipped the mop again, the gray waters swirling like storm clouds in a bucket. The rhythmic motion soothed her. Dip, ring, swipe, until the sound of footsteps broke her trance. A tall man had entered the lobby from the rain, shaking droplets from his jacket. He moved with a kind of quiet authority, the type of posture that made space obey him. His clothes were simple. Faded jeans, gray Henley shirt, boots clean but worn from long miles. His hair was cropped close, military short, his jaw darkened with the roughness of travel. He carried nothing but a paperback novel folded at the corner, scanned the room, then chose the farthest corner chair near the vending machine. Without a word, he sat, opened the book, and didn't read a single page. His name, though Grace wouldn't learn it until later, was Eli Carson. To anyone else, he was just another quiet face avoiding the rain. But beneath that stillness, Eli was measuring exits, lines of sight, and the angles of reflection in the glass doors. Old habits from 17 years in the Navy SEALs didn't fade easily. He had come home from his last deployment 3 weeks ago, and the silence had been unbearable. The community center, with its noise and fluorescent hum, was the closest thing he could find to peace. Grace noticed him only briefly at first, the way janitors notice furniture that wasn't there yesterday. But when she returned to refill her bucket, she saw his eyes. They were gray, the color of low clouds, but steady, observant, calm in a way that made her feel seen yet safe. She looked away quickly. "Evenin'," he said softly, his voice rough like gravel and warmth. "Evenin'," she replied, keeping her hands busy with the mop handle. For a while, the only sound was the swish of mop water and the slow turning of a page that wasn't being read. Outside, thunder muttered in the distance. Inside, the lights flickered once. Grace turned toward Ranger. The dog had lifted his head, ears twitching. His body tensed the way a soldier does before a storm. "It's okay," she whispered. But her voice trembled. From the hallway ahead came the sharp bark of a man's voice. "No, no, no! That's not how you pivot! Do it again!" It was followed by a loud thwack, the sound of a foot striking a training pad, and a boy's frightened apology. Grace's stomach knotted. She knew that voice. Dante Cruz, the Taekwondo instructor, ran his evening classes like a tyrant. Once, Grace had mopped outside his studio and watched a boy leave in tears. She'd said something about kindness. Dante had laughed, called her the help, and said, "Maybe if you'd worked harder in life, you wouldn't be pushing that bucket." After that, she'd learned to avoid his door. But tonight, as fate would have it, her path led right past his studio again. The class ended early. The glass door swung open. Dante stepped out, wiping sweat from his neck, wearing his black belt like a badge of divinity. His eyes landed on her. "Well, if it isn't the Queen of Bleach," he sneered. "You missed a spot, Grace." She froze, her mop halfway through a stroke. "I was just finishing this haul." "And dragging that mud along again?" He looked down at Ranger, who pressed himself against her leg. "What is that thing even doing here?" He's my service dog," she lied quietly. "Mrs. Paxton said," "I don't care what Mrs. Paxton said." He stepped closer, the soles of his training shoes squeaking against the wet tile. "This is a martial arts facility, not a dog park." Ranger whimpered. Grace's hands trembled. "He's not hurting anyone," she whispered. Dante's lip curled. "Then he won't mind this." He nudged the bucket with his foot, then deliberately kicked it hard. The water surged across the floor, splattering Grace's shoes, soaking Ranger's fur. The dog yelped, skidding on the slippery tile. Grace gasped, dropping to her knees. "No, Ranger!" Dante laughed. "Look at that. You and your dog, same posture." The laugh died almost instantly. A low growl rolled through the air, not from Ranger this time, but from behind Dante. Eli had stood up. He said nothing at first, only looked at Dante with the detached focus of someone deciding whether a threat needed elimination. "Something funny, buddy?" Dante snapped. "This doesn't concern you." Eli's tone was calm, too calm. "It does now." The hallway seemed to shrink. Grace could hear her heartbeat. Dante turned toward Eli, puffing his chest the way small men do when they need the world to see their size. "You think you can tell me what to do? I don't fight civilians, pal." Eli's voice dropped lower. "That's good. I'm not here to fight. I'm here to stop one." Something in his stare, controlled, deliberate, made Dante hesitate for half a heartbeat. But ego is a dangerous master. He shoved Eli's shoulder. "Back off." Eli didn't move. Not an inch. What happened next would later blur in Grace's mind into flashes. Dante's hand reaching out again, Eli's wrist turning, a sound like dry wood snapping. Dante's cry. A single smooth motion that ended with the instructor pinned face down on the tile, his arm locked behind him, the mop bucket rolling slowly to a stop. Eli leaned close, his voice so soft Grace almost didn't hear it. "You ever touch her or that dog again," he said, "and I'll teach you what real discipline is." When he released him, Dante scrambled to his feet, his face pale with fury and humiliation. He didn't speak. He just stumbled back into the studio and slammed the door. Silence filled the hallway again, thick, electric. Grace sat beside Ranger, her hands shaking, tears threatening but not falling. Eli knelt a few feet away, his expression unreadable, his breath steady. "You okay, ma'am?" he asked gently. She nodded, though her voice failed her. He glanced at the trembling dog. "He's hurt," Eli murmured. "Might be ribs. You got a vet nearby?" "There's one on River Street," she whispered. Eli rose, extending a hand. "Let's go." Grace hesitated. She didn't even know his name. But when she looked into his gray eyes, calm, steady, the eyes of someone who had seen the worst the world could give and still stood firm, she found herself taking his hand. Outside, the rain had stopped, but the streets still shimmered like mirrors. The three of them, an ex-soldier, a broken woman, and a wounded dog, walked out into the night together. And though none of them knew it yet, this would be the beginning of something neither healing nor love alone could explain. Something closer to redemption. Morning came slowly to Savannah, a wash of pale amber light crawling across the quiet streets. The city had that soft, half-forgotten calm it wore before traffic and noise took over. Inside the community center, the scent of lemon cleaner still hung in the air, a ghost of the night before. Eli Carson sat in the corner cafe across from the center, his hands around a cup of black coffee gone cold. He hadn't slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the woman's face, Grace, kneeling on the wet tile, her hands trembling as she tried to comfort her terrified dog. He'd seen trauma in every shade of human experience, but what haunted him wasn't the violence. It was her silence. The kind of silence that doesn't come from fear, but from long practice. Someone who had learned to survive by not taking up space. He knew that silence too well. Across the street, the morning crowd trickled in, the retirees for their water aerobics, the mothers with toddlers in tow. The same rhythm of ordinary life continuing as if the previous night's ugliness had never happened. Eli wanted to believe that it had ended there, but instinct told him the story wasn't finished. Men like Dante Cruz didn't take humiliation quietly. He finished his coffee, left a $5 bill under the cup, and crossed the street. Inside, the world was bright again. Grace wasn't there. Her shift ended at dawn. He could still see the faint scuff marks where the bucket had tipped over, the dull trail of mop water that dried into gray ghosts on the floor. Somewhere behind the front desk, he could hear Mrs. Paxton humming as she sorted mail. She gave him a quick smile as he walked by. He was just another civilian, another face passing through. But the muffled thuds from the Taekwondo studio down the hall drew him like a magnet. The sign on the door still read, Lions Taekwondo, Master Dante Cruz, 4th degree black belt. Through the glass, Eli could see the man himself pacing the mat like a restless predator, his arm wrapped in a brace, his expression thunderous. Inside, a dozen students stood rigid, waiting for instruction. They were mostly teenagers, nervous energy wrapped in white doughbox. The room smelled of sweat and disinfectant. "Reset!" Dante barked. His voice cracked like a whip. "Your stance is weak. You're not lions, you're kittens." The kids obeyed immediately, reforming their lines. He stalked between them, his eyes sweeping the room, looking for someone to punish. Eli watched from the hall, unseen. He'd met instructors like this all over the world, men who confused power with control. "Again!" Dante snapped. "Roundhouse kick, high! I want power, not pity." A boy at the far end, small and wiry, flinched at the shout. His leg rose, wavered, and dropped too soon. Dante's face darkened. He stalked over and slammed his clipboard onto the mat. "You call that a kick? My grandmother hits harder than that." I'm trying, sir," the boy stammered. "Try harder." Dante shoved his shoulder, not enough to injure, but enough to humiliate. "Do it again. And don't cry." The boy blinked hard, biting back tears. The other students stood frozen. No one dared speak. Eli had seen enough. His fingers tightened around the strap of his duffel bag until his knuckles went white. He wanted to step in, but Grace's voice from the night before echoed in his memory. "He's not hurting anyone. Please." He forced himself to breathe. He was a visitor here, not a soldier, not anymore. Still, his eyes stayed on the boy until Dante turned away. Grace returned to the center that afternoon, exhausted from another shift cleaning a nearby diner. She paused at the front desk to clock in, smiling faintly at Mrs. Paxton's kind greeting. Her hands still smelled faintly of dish soap, and the ache in her shoulders felt permanent. Ranger padded quietly beside her, tail low but wagging once in recognition of the familiar halls. When they reached the janitor's closet, she found something unexpected, a folded note on her supply cart. "You did nothing wrong last night. Don't let him make you smaller. E." Her heart skipped. The handwriting was simple, blocky, unmistakably masculine. For the first time in months, she smiled without forcing it. But the smile faded quickly when the Taekwondo door slammed open again. Dante's voice cut through the hallway like a blade. "Grace!" Her blood went cold. She turned slowly. He was standing there, sweat slick on his forehead, his arm still in the brace, but his arrogance intact. "We need to talk." Ranger's ears flattened. "Mr. Cruz," she began carefully, You think you can embarrass me and walk away? You had your boyfriend jump me in front of my students." His tone dripped venom. Grace shook her head, horrified. "He's not. He was helping." "Helping?" Dante stepped closer. "You think that thug helped you? He assaulted me. I could have him arrested, unless..." He paused, letting the word hang like bait. "Unless you make this right." Grace's mouth went dry. What do you mean? Apologize, he said simply. In front of my class. Admit you were out of line, that your dog attacked me. Ranger whimpered, sensing her fear. I can't do that, she whispered. You can. Or you can find another job. I know the director here. I can make sure your name doesn't get hired anywhere in this city again. For a heartbeat, Grace saw the flames again, the inferno that had taken Mark. The sound of collapsing beams, the scream she never stopped hearing. She had learned to live small because fighting back always led to more loss. I'll think about it, she said weakly. Do that, Dante hissed. You've got until tomorrow. He turned, and for an instant his eyes flicked toward Ranger. And keep that beast out of my sight. When he left, Grace sank to the cloth floor, shaking. Ranger pressed his head against her knees, whining softly. She buried her fingers in his fur, whispering, It's okay, boy. It's okay. But her voice broke halfway through the words. Later that night, Eli returned to the community center under the pretense of retrieving his lost book. In truth, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. When he stepped inside, the hall was dimly lit. Grace was there, kneeling by the mop bucket, her shoulders trembling. Ranger lifted his head at Eli's approach and gave a quiet whine of recognition. Ranger likes you, she said without turning. I like him too, Eli replied gently. You're shaking. I'm fine. He waited a moment. That man, Cruz, he threatened you again, didn't he? She looked up then, eyes glistening. He wants me to apologize. Says I'll lose my job if I don't. Eli exhaled through his nose. And you're thinking of doing it? I can't afford to lose this job, she laughed bitterly. You can't pay bills with pride. He crouched beside her. You can live without money for a while. You can't live without dignity. The words hung there between them, heavy and real. Ranger nudged Eli's hand, then laid his head in Grace's lap. The gesture broke something in her. Tears slipped silently down her cheeks. I used to be someone, she whispered. A nurse. I helped people. Now I just clean up after them. Eli didn't speak for a long time. He just listened, the kind of listening that felt like shelter. Finally, he said, Maybe you're still helping people, just in a way no one notices. She looked at him then, truly looked. For the first time, she saw the faint scar along his jaw, the tired lines around his eyes. You're military, aren't you? He nodded once. Was. Navy. Do you ever stop being that? He smiled faintly, a sad half-smile. No. You just learn to carry it quieter. Thunder rumbled in the distance again. The air smelled of rain, heavy and electric. Eli rose and looked down the hallway toward the Taekwondo studio. Behind the frosted glass, he could see the glow of lights still on. Dante was pacing, phone pressed to his ear, face twisted with fury. Eli's instincts tightened. He's planning something, he murmured. Grace frowned. What do you mean? Eli didn't answer. He was already scanning exits, calculating angles, the soldier waking inside the man. For the rest of the night, Grace felt the air shift around her, as if the walls themselves were waiting for something. And somewhere deep inside her fear, a strange new certainty began to grow. Maybe this time, she wasn't alone in the fight. Outside, the rain began again, soft at first, then steady, washing the streets clean for whatever storm tomorrow would bring. The storm hit Savannah before dawn, a rolling percussion of thunder that made the city's windows tremble. The community center slept beneath the storm, dark and silent, except for the hum of the exit signs and the faint squeak of rubber soles on wet tile. Grace Miller was finishing her shift early. The forecast promised flooding, and Mrs. Paxton had told her to lock up and go home before the roads turned into rivers. But Grace didn't want to go home. The little apartment she rented above an old pawn shop was too quiet, too full of ghosts. Ranger, still limping slightly from his cracked ribs, padded beside her. He didn't like thunder. Every low rumble made him flinch, ears flat, eyes darting to every shadow. Grace murmured, "It's okay, sweetheart. We'll be done soon." When she turned the corner into the main hall, her breath caught. The lights were already on in the Taekwondo studio. Dante Cruz. She froze. It was too early for classes, but the rhythmic thwack of kicks echoed through the door like gunfire. She should have turned around. She should have left the building entirely. But something in her, the same stubborn spark that once kept her running triage under fire alarms and falling ceilings, made her pause. She wanted to believe that maybe last night had broken something open in him. Maybe he'd seen himself clearly for the first time. Maybe he'd stop. Then came the shout. "You think you're tough now? You think one old janitor and her dog can make me look like a fool?" The voice was pure venom. Grace's heart stumbled. She wasn't supposed to be here, but Ranger growled low in his chest, already sensing the rise of tension. She reached down, her trembling hand brushing his collar. "Stay close," she whispered. The door slammed open. Dante stood in the threshold, sweat gleaming on his temple, his arm brace gone. His eyes burned when he saw her. "You again." Grace took a step back, her mop handle trembling in her hands. I'm just cleaning." "You think you can walk around here like you're innocent?" he spat. "You and your boyfriend humiliated me in front of my students. You cost me 3 clients already. You think that's funny?" "I never—" He moved faster than she expected, seizing the mop handle. "You don't get to talk." The stick cracked against the floor. Ranger barked, a sharp, defensive sound. Dante looked down at the dog, his lip curling. "And you. I should have finished what I started." Grace's body moved before her mind caught up. She stepped between them. "Don't you touch him!" For a heartbeat, the entire hallway was lightening. Then Dante smiled, cruel and slow. "You just made a mistake." He swung the broken mop handle toward Ranger. It never landed. Something blurred between them, a motion too fast, too precise. The wooden shaft splintered in midair, knocked aside by an arm that had appeared from nowhere. Eli Carson. He stood there, soaked from the rain, his eyes cold silver under the flickering lights. "I warned you," he said quietly. Dante blinked, stumbling back. "You again?" "Yeah," Eli replied. "Me again." The hall fell silent, except for the storm raging outside. Thunder rolled like a drumbeat for what was about to happen. Dante grinned, teeth flashing. "You think you can come in here and play hero? You don't belong here, Navy boy." Eli didn't answer. He stepped forward, his body loose, centered. No tension, no bluster, just readiness. Dante lunged first, his ego too loud to let patience win. His kick cut the air, a flawless roundhouse, the kind that wins medals in tournaments. Eli didn't block. He simply tilted his torso 2 inches. The kick missed by a whisper, wind brushing his shirt. Dante blinked, recalibrating. "Lucky," he growled, and attacked again. A spinning hook kick this time. But the second his heel lifted, Eli stepped forward, inside the arc, his hand catching Dante's wrist mid-motion. A twist, a shift of weight, and the world flipped. Whoomp! Dante hit the floor, flat on his back, the air knocked clean out of him. Grace gasped. She'd never seen anything like it. Eli hadn't raised his voice, hadn't even seemed angry. He was a storm moving quietly through a smaller man's chaos. Dante coughed, scrambling up, fury flooding his face. "You're dead," he snarled, charging again. Eli sidestepped, caught him by the collar and used his momentum to spin him face first into the wall. The sound was dull and heavy. He leaned in close, his voice low enough only Grace could hear. "Walk away." But Dante didn't. He twisted, wild, landing a lucky elbow to Eli's jaw. The impact barely turned the seal's head. Eli's expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes hardened. The soldier was fully awake now. The next moment, Dante's right arm was bent backward, pinned, and his knees buckled as Eli's boot pressed gently, but decisively, on his shoulder blade. Eli spoke, his voice a steel thread through the thunder. "I could break your arm. I won't. Not because you don't deserve it, but because she's watching." He shifted pressure slightly, enough to make Dante gasp. "You'll leave her alone. You'll forget her name. You'll act like she never existed." Dante groaned, face red from effort and humiliation. "Or what?" Eli leaned closer. "Or I'll remember you." For a man like Dante, that was enough. When Eli let him go, he staggered to his feet, clutching his arm. "This isn't over," he hissed. "You don't know who you're messing with." "I know exactly who I'm looking at," Eli said. "A bully who just got shown what real control looks like." Dante backed away, spitting on the floor before storming toward the door. He paused only to throw one last glare at Grace. "You're finished here, you hear me? Finished!" The door slammed. For several seconds, the only sound was Ranger's soft whine. Grace sank to the floor, tears sliding silently down her cheeks. She wasn't crying from fear anymore, it was something else. Relief. Shock. The realization that for once, someone had stood between her and the cruelty she'd long accepted as normal. Eli crouched down beside her, keeping his distance so he didn't crowd her space. "You okay?" "I think so," she whispered. "He would have hurt him." "I know." Ranger nudged Eli's knee, tail wagging once, slow but trusting. The sight of it drew the faintest smile from Eli's face. "He's tougher than he looks." "So are you," Grace said softly. Eli looked at her then, really looked, the exhaustion around her eyes, the bruised half-moon shadows of too many sleepless nights. "You shouldn't have to be afraid at your job." Grace let out a trembling laugh. "Fear's cheaper than rent." Eli tilted his head. "You always joke when you're scared." "Only when someone else is brave enough for both of us." Their eyes met. and for the first time something warm flickered between them, fragile, uncertain, but real. Outside, the storm began to fade, thunder retreating over the river. A single shaft of early morning light broke through the windows, cutting across the wet floor where the mop bucket had fallen. Eli stood and offered his hand again. Grace hesitated only a moment before taking it. Her palm was cold, calloused from hard work, but he held it as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "Come on," he said. "Let's get Ranger checked again. He took a scare today." She nodded, gathering the leash. They walked side by side toward the exit, the storm's last raindrops tapping softly against the glass doors. Behind them, in the dim corridor, a broken mop handle still lay on the floor, a quiet relic of everything that had just changed. Outside, the air smelled of salt and wet earth, the kind of clean that comes only after something violent. The sun was rising, painting the Savannah River gold, and though Grace didn't know it yet, her life had just shifted course. For the first time in years, someone had fought for her. And for Eli, who had sworn he was done fighting for anything that wasn't life or death. That terrified him more than any battlefield ever could. The emergency vet clinic sat at the edge of town, a lonely square of fluorescent light in the soft Georgia rain. The smell of iodine and wet fur met them before the automatic doors even opened. Grace followed close behind Eli, clutching Ranger's leash with trembling hands, her sneakers squeaking across the tile floor. The night staff, 2 techs and a young veterinarian, looked up from the reception counter with tired eyes that softened at the sight of the limp German shepherd in Eli's arms. The vet, Dr. Lena Ortiz, barely 30 and still wearing the exhaustion of residency, hurried forward. "What happened?" Eli's answer was clipped, efficient, the way soldiers give reports. "Blunt force trauma to the ribs, conscious, shallow breathing, likely cracked ribs, possible contusion." Dr. Ortiz blinked, surprised at his precision. "You a vet tech?" He hesitated. "Military." "Right. Bring him through, room 3. Grace trailed them down the corridor, her hands shaking. Every fluorescent bulb buzzed too loudly. Every sound of clinking metal instruments sent her nerves trembling. The sight of Ranger being lifted onto the steel table twisted her stomach. He let out a low, pained whimper, and she flinched as if struck herself. Dr. Ortiz worked with calm speed, running her hands gently down the dog's sides. "He's lucky," she said after a few moments. 2 ribs cracked, 1 bruised, but no internal bleeding. "We'll wrap him, give him something for pain, and he'll need rest. No stairs, no running, no rough play." Grace nodded, tears finally spilling down her cheeks. "Thank you," she whispered. Eli stood in the corner, arms folded, silent as a statue. But when he saw her shoulders shake, something inside him shifted. He had seen soldiers cry over fallen comrades, mothers over flag-draped coffins. But there was something rawer about this. A woman grieving for the one creature that hadn't yet left her. When the vet finished and left them alone, Grace reached out to stroke Ranger's muzzle. "You'll be okay, buddy," she murmured. "You're stronger than me." "You're both still standing," Eli said softly. Grace wiped her eyes, embarrassed. "I don't know why you keep helping me." "Because someone should." "That's not an answer." He leaned against the wall, gaze fixed on the rain running down the window. "When I came home, I thought I'd be done with fighting. I was wrong. Sometimes the world still needs defending. It just looks different now." She turned to him, her expression weary but curious. "You sound like someone who's seen too much." "I have," he admitted. "Lost people. Good ones. Sometimes you don't realize what war does until the noise stops, and you can still hear it inside you." Grace's voice softened. "My husband was a firefighter. He died trying to save a little girl. I told myself I should be proud. But every time I closed my eyes, I saw smoke, not light." There was silence for a moment, broken only by the rhythmic beep of the heart monitor on the table. Two people who had lived through fire and gunfire, both burned in their own ways, found themselves in a fragile peace that neither had sought. Ranger lifted his head slightly, groaning, and Eli moved closer. "He's going to pull through," he said gently. "He's got fight left in him." Grace smiled through her tears. "Maybe he got it from you." He shook his head. "No, he got it from you. He wouldn't have survived if you hadn't stood up for him." The vet returned with a clipboard and a bottle of medication. "Anti-inflammatory, every 12 hours. He'll need 2 weeks before he's back to normal. And keep him warm." Grace took the prescription slip, her fingers brushing Eli's for a moment. "How much do I owe?" Dr. Ortiz hesitated. "I can set up a payment plan. I'll cover it," Eli said immediately, pulling out his wallet. Grace turned, startled. "You can't." "I can." He handed over his card, his tone final but gentle. "Consider it a service expense." She didn't argue again. Some kindnesses weren't meant to be refused. Outside, the rain had thinned to a mist, wrapping the parking lot in a silver haze. The smell of wet asphalt mixed with the faint sweetness of honeysuckle from the fence beyond. Eli carried Ranger carefully, his strength effortless, the dog's head resting against his shoulder. Grace walked beside him, her hand hovering near Ranger's paw as if to steady him through sheer will. When they reached Eli's truck, he opened the back door and laid Ranger gently across a folded blanket. "You got someone waiting for you at home?" he asked. She shook her head. "Just him." "Then I'll take you." "You've already done too much." Eli looked at her then, his gray eyes steady, the rain dripping from his hair. "Ma'am, I've seen what happens when people decide they've done enough. The world doesn't get better that way." Grace smiled faintly. "You always talk like you're still on a mission." He gave a small shrug. "Maybe I am." The drive back was quiet. Savannah's streets glowed under the mist, the old oak trees arching overhead like cathedrals. Grace watched the city through the window, the raindrops chasing each other down the glass. For the first time in years, she didn't feel the ache of being invisible. Someone had noticed. Someone had stayed. When they reached her apartment, Eli helped her carry Ranger up the narrow staircase. The dog whimpered once but settled when Eli laid him on a blanket near the heater. Grace knelt beside him, brushing his fur gently. "You're safe now," she whispered. Eli looked around the room, small, clean, sparsely decorated. A single framed photo on the table showed Grace and her husband, Mark, smiling under a bright 4th of July sky. The edges of the photo were worn, the glass cracked. "He was a good man?" Eli asked quietly. "The best," she said. "He used to bring home stray dogs, said every creature deserved one more chance." Her hand trembled as she touched the photo. "I guess I stopped believing that." Eli crouched beside her. Then maybe it's time you start again. Grace looked at him, eyes rimmed red. Why do you care so much? You don't even know me. He thought for a moment. Because I've seen what happens when good people stop caring, and because I know what it's like to need someone to stand between you and the world. She blinked, a tear sliding down her cheek. You really don't know when to stop helping people, do you? Not really, he said with a faint smile. The clock ticked softly. The rain eased. Grace leaned back against the wall, exhausted but lighter somehow. Eli stood to leave, pausing at the door. Get some rest, he said. I'll check on you both tomorrow. Eli, she called after him. He turned. Thank you for everything. He nodded once. Just doing my job. But you said you don't have one anymore. He smiled, small, almost shy. Guess I just found a new one. When the door closed, Grace sat in the quiet apartment, listening to Ranger's steady breathing. For the first time in years, the silence didn't feel empty. It felt safe. Outside, dawn was breaking. The clouds thinned and light began to spill through the blinds, painting the room in soft gold. Grace tilted her face toward it and let out a long breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. She reached for Ranger's paw and whispered, Maybe people like him still exist. Maybe we get another chance after all. And though she couldn't see him anymore, Eli Carson was already walking back through the wet streets of Savannah, the soldier in him silent again, for now. He didn't know why he'd stayed, or why that woman and her dog had anchored him in a way combat never could. All he knew was that for the first time since returning home, the quiet didn't scare him. It sounded like peace. The rain had stopped hours ago, but the city was still dripping. Every awning, every lamppost, every low-hanging branch trembling with beads of leftover water. Savannah at midnight felt like a dream someone forgot to wake from. The streets were slick mirrors, the air heavy with the smell of wet pine and gasoline. Eli Carson stood outside the vet clinic, leaning against his truck. The night had been quiet so far. Too quiet. Inside, the waiting room light flickered over Grace and Ranger. The dog was sedated, bandaged neatly, breathing in slow, shallow waves. Grace sat beside him on the floor, her back against the wall, her head drooping from exhaustion. She hadn't wanted to go home until Ranger woke. Eli had insisted she rest. You're safe here, he'd told her. But as the minutes passed, the soldier in him started to whisper that old, unwelcome mantra. When things are too calm, danger is moving closer. He checked the time. 12:42 a.m. The parking lot was nearly empty. Just his truck, a sedan near the corner, and the faint hum of a street lamp throwing light across puddles. The sound of rainwater dripping from the clinic's metal awning filled the silence. And then he saw it. Headlights, far too bright, sweeping slowly across the lot. A car pulled in and parked at the far end, engine idling. Then another, and another. 3 sets of headlights, like eyes opening in the dark. Eli straightened. His pulse didn't quicken. If anything, it slowed. His breathing became measured. His shoulders lowered, muscles relaxing into readiness. The driver's door of the first car opened. Out stepped Dante Cruz, arms still in a brace, his face pale and drawn, but his eyes burning. He wasn't alone. 5 men climbed out of the other cars, broad-shouldered, rough, wearing dark jackets and ball caps. The metallic clink of something being lifted from a trunk cut through the night. Bats. Eli muttered. So this is how you want it. Inside the clinic, Grace stirred at the sound of engines. She looked toward the window, confusion clouding her drowsy eyes. Eli? He turned, forcing calm into his voice. Stay here. Lock the door. What's happening? Just do it. There was something in his tone, quiet command, not anger, that made her obey instantly. She scrambled to the door and clicked the bolt just as Eli stepped outside into the mist. Dante's voice carried across the lot, oily and triumphant. Thought you could humiliate me, soldier boy? In my own place? Eli's boots splashed lightly through a puddle as he walked forward, hands loose at his sides. You should have stayed home, Cruz. You're making it worse. Worse? Dante laughed, the sound sharp and unhinged. No, this is justice. He lifted his good hand and gestured to his men. Teach him what happens when you mess with a lion. The first man moved fast, swinging the bat in a wide arc aimed at Eli's ribs. But Eli stepped forward instead of back, the movement sharp and decisive. The bat cut through the air where he'd been a second ago, and Eli's left hand shot out, striking the man's throat with an open palm. The attacker dropped immediately, choking, his weapon clattering to the pavement. The second one came from the right. Eli caught the falling bat midair, pivoted, and drove the handle hard into the man's knee. The crack of bone echoed across the lot, followed by a scream. 2 down. 4 seconds. The next pair hesitated, exchanging a glance before rushing together. Eli dropped the bat. It was too slow. He sidestepped the first, slammed an elbow into the man's temple, then spun, driving his forearm into the other's jaw. Both went down in a heap of curses and groans. The fifth man froze. His hands trembled around his weapon. Screw this, he muttered, tossing the bat and backing away. Smart, Eli said. Dante's face twisted in disbelief. No, how are you doing this? Eli turned toward him, gray eyes cold and steady. I stopped fighting people like you a long time ago. You just don't know when to quit. Dante's voice rose, wild and broken. You ruined me! My students left, my reputation, everything! You did that yourself. Dante's hand darted into his jacket. Eli saw the motion before it was finished. He lunged forward, grabbed the wrist, and twisted. A small folding knife clattered to the ground. In the same motion, Eli swept Dante's legs out from under him and drove him backward into the hood of his own car. The impact knocked the wind out of him. Eli pinned him there, one forearm across his chest. This is your last warning, Eli said. You walk away tonight, and you live. You push this, and you won't like what comes next. Dante spat blood, trembling. You think you can stop me? Eli's gaze hardened. I already did. The distant wail of sirens rose through the night. Dante's men scrambled, limping, clutching their injuries, diving into their cars. Tires screeched against wet asphalt. Only Dante stayed, pinned beneath Eli's forearm. His eyes darted wildly toward the flashing red lights rounding the corner. Go, Eli said finally, releasing him. Dante stumbled to his feet, clutching his ribs, glaring like a wounded animal. This isn't over. It's over, Eli replied quietly. You just don't know it yet. When the police cars pulled in, the chaos froze under their lights. 4 men on the ground, one staggering toward the curb, weapons scattered like confessions across the lot. 2 officers stepped out, guns raised. "Hands where we can see them," one barked. Eli lifted his hands calmly, the picture of control. "They attacked first," he said. "Security cameras on the clinic will show it." Inside the building, Grace stood by the window, heart hammering. She saw the red and blue lights strobing across Eli's face as he spoke to the officers, calm as if reciting grocery list. When she finally opened the door, the air smelled of oil, blood, and rain. "Eli?" she called, her voice breaking. He turned, eyes softening. "You okay?" She nodded, stepping closer, her gaze sweeping over the fallen men. "You could have been killed." He gave a faint, tired smile. "Not tonight." The older officer, Sergeant Riley, approached with a clipboard. "We've got witnesses. The clinic staff called 911. Security footage, too. Looks like self-defense." Her eyes traveled from the unconscious men to Eli's calm posture. "You military?" "Used to be," he said. "Thought so. You handle yourself like one of ours." She nodded. "We'll take it from here." As the police loaded Dante's men into cruisers, Grace watched them go. One of the younger officers whispered to another, "That guy dropped 6 of them bare-handed." Eli ignored it. He only looked at Grace. "You need to get home," he said quietly. "Get some rest." "Not without you." He hesitated, studying her face. She looked fragile under the fluorescent glare, her wet hair plastered to her cheeks, her eyes wide with exhaustion and something deeper, fear laced with gratitude. "Okay," he said finally. "Let's go." They drove through the sleeping city, past gas stations and shuttered shops. The silence between them wasn't empty. It was charged, alive. Grace sat with her hands in her lap, staring at the faint bruises on Eli's knuckles. "You could have killed them," she said softly. "I know. But you didn't." He kept his eyes on the road. "That's the part they don't teach you in the field, when not to finish the fight." When they reached her building, Eli parked and turned to her. The storm clouds were clearing, revealing a sliver of moonlight. "You're safe now," he said. Grace's eyes glistened. "I was never safe before tonight." He didn't know what to say to that, so he didn't. As he turned to leave, she reached out, her hand brushing his arm. "Eli, thank you." He looked down at her, that steady soldier's calm softening into something human. "Get some sleep, Grace." When she climbed the stairs to her apartment, she looked back once. He was still there, leaning against his truck, watching the street, as if it still needed guarding. The red-blue glow of the patrol lights reflected in his eyes, fading slowly into silver as the cars drove away. And for the first time since Mark's death, she believed that maybe, just maybe, the world still had protectors, quiet ones, the kind who never asked to be heroes. Savannah woke the next morning to soft light and the smell of rain-soaked jasmine. The storm had passed, leaving the streets washed clean and quiet. But for Grace Miller, peace was still a fragile thing. She sat at her kitchen table, a cup of untouched coffee growing cold in her hands, Ranger sleeping nearby on a folded blanket. The dog's ribs were bandaged, his breathing steady, but every small sound, a passing car, a closing door, made his ears twitch. Grace's own body felt the same way, wired and trembling even in stillness. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the blur of movement from the parking lot, The flash of headlights, the dull thud of bodies hitting pavement, the unearthly calm in Eli Carson's eyes. She had seen violence before, in hospital trauma bays and burning buildings, but never wrapped in such silence, such precision. It wasn't rage that fueled him. It was something colder, deeper, a kind of mercy too disciplined to be gentle. She reached for her phone, scrolling through the morning news out of habit. Her fingers froze halfway. Local self-defense incident. Ex-Navy SEAL stops armed assault outside veterinary clinic. The article was brief but unmistakable. No names, no details, just enough. A man identified as a retired SEAL subdued multiple attackers in a parking lot last night. Police confirm it was an act of self-defense. Grace let out a small, unsteady laugh. A retired SEAL, she murmured to Ranger. Well, that explains a lot. Ranger lifted his head and thumped his tail once, as if agreeing. A knock came at the door. She stiffened. For one split second, her heart leapt into her throat. Then the familiar voice came through, low and even. It's me. Grace opened the door to find Eli standing there, jeans still damp from the previous night's rain, a brown paper bag in one hand. You shouldn't be walking around, she said softly. Old habits die hard, he said, stepping inside. I brought breakfast. He set the bag on the counter and pulled out 2 cups of steaming coffee and a couple of bagels from a small bakery on River Street. He moved like a man who didn't need to fill silence, who had long since made peace with it. Grace watched him for a moment, his quiet efficiency, the faint bruise on his jaw, the way his eyes scanned the room once before settling. Even now, he was assessing exits. Did the police say anything? She asked finally. They took statements. They've got the security footage, the confession from one of Cruz's guys. It's over. Over, she echoed, as if testing the word for cracks. Eli leaned against the counter, his coffee untouched. You still don't feel safe. Grace hesitated. I don't know what that feels like anymore. He nodded slowly, as if he understood too well. Takes time. You can't scrub fear off like dirt, Grace. The way he said her name made her look up. It wasn't pity in his voice. It was something steadier, something that anchored her. After breakfast, he crouched beside Ranger, checking the bandages with surprising gentleness. He's healing fast, Eli murmured, but he's scared of his own shadow. He's been like that since the shelter, Grace said quietly. He doesn't trust easily. Neither do you. Grace blinked at him, unsure if it was accusation or understanding. I didn't either, he added softly. For a long time. The morning passed quietly. Eli fixed the squeaky hinge on her window, the one she'd learned to ignore years ago. He replaced a burnt-out light bulb above the sink. When she offered to pay, he waved it off. You saved that dog's life, he said. That's payment enough. By afternoon, the police stopped by. Sergeant Riley, her sunglasses pushed up into her short-cropped hair. Just tying loose ends, she said with a tired smile. Cruz and his men are facing assault, conspiracy, and animal cruelty charges. They won't be seeing daylight for a while. Grace exhaled shakily. Thank you. Riley's gaze shifted to Eli. You ever think of joining the department? We could use someone who can end a fight without firing a shot. Eli smiled faintly. "Ma'am, I've had enough paperwork for one lifetime." Riley chuckled. "Fair enough." Then to Grace, "You're lucky he was there." Grace glanced at Eli, her voice quiet but firm. "I know." When the officer left, the apartment felt strangely empty, as if some invisible noise had been turned off. Grace looked around, her hands fidgeting. "I don't know what to do with myself now. For months I just worked, cleaned, slept. That was it. And now it's like I don't know who I am." Eli folded his arms. "Then start small." "How?" He nodded toward Ranger, who was watching them from his blanket. "Start with him. You both need to learn how to breathe again." So they did. Over the next few days, Eli visited every morning. They took short walks by the river when Ranger was strong enough, the dog's tail wagging more each time. They drank coffee on Grace's balcony, the scent of salt and marsh grass rising from the water. Sometimes they talked about small things like old movies or Savannah's summer humidity, and sometimes they didn't talk at all. The silence between them had changed. It no longer felt like a wound. One afternoon, as Eli repaired the broken latch on her window, Grace leaned against the doorframe. "You know," she said, "most people would have walked away that night. Most people aren't trained to run toward trouble. But why help me?" He paused, looking out the window at the gray horizon. "Because I saw myself," he said finally. "Someone just trying to keep breathing." Grace swallowed hard. "You make it sound so simple." "It's not, but it's worth it." She smiled then, small but real. "I don't remember the last time someone said something was worth it." Later that evening, while the sun melted into the Savannah River, Eli sat cross-legged on the floor beside Ranger, showing Grace how to desensitize him to the sound of doors closing. He demonstrated patience she hadn't known existed. Every soft click of the door was followed by a treat, a reassuring word, and a gentle touch. "It's not about control," Eli said quietly. "It's about rebuilding trust. You can't force trust. It grows in the quiet moments." Grace watched the way Ranger's tail began to wag, slow but steady. "You're good at this," she said. "I used to train canine units overseas. They saved more lives than most people ever will." He looked up at her then, his gray eyes soft. "Sometimes I think dogs understand faith better than we do." Grace's voice trembled. "Maybe they just know who deserves it." The room grew quiet, filled only with the hum of crickets outside. Eli stood, brushing his hands on his jeans. "He's doing better," he said. "And so are you." She laughed lightly. "You think so? I know so." The laughter faded into a silence that felt different, heavier, charged. Grace stepped closer, the golden light from the window catching in her hair. "When you leave," she said softly, "this place will feel empty again." Eli's jaw tightened. "My leave's almost over." "How long do you have?" 2 days." She nodded slowly, looking at the floor. "Then I guess I should start saying goodbye." He hesitated, then reached out, brushing his fingers gently over her forearm. "Goodbyes don't always mean endings, Grace. Sometimes they're just pauses." Her eyes shimmered. "Do you always talk like that?" He smiled faintly. "Only when I mean it." That night, after he left, Grace stood on the balcony, Ranger resting his head on her knee. The sky above the river was clear for the first time in weeks, the stars sharp and bright. She thought of Eli's calm voice, his quiet strength, and how his presence had drawn her back from the edge she hadn't realized she was standing on. For years, she'd believed her life had ended with her husband's. Now, somehow, it felt like the first chapter of something new had just begun. Down the street, Eli's truck turned the corner, its headlights briefly catching her face. He didn't wave, but he didn't have to. In that silent passing, they both knew something unspoken had taken root between them. Something fragile, real, and alive. And in the soft hum of the night, for the first time in years, Grace felt it. The quiet, steady pulse of hope. The dawn broke over Savannah in a hush of pale gold and low mist. The city's breath was still, the air thick with that faint sweetness that comes after a long rain. The scent of washed earth, iron, and the promise of something new. On the balcony of her small apartment, Grace Miller stood barefoot, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders. The river below gleamed like molten glass beneath the sunrise. Beside her, Ranger slept curled at her feet, chest rising and falling in slow, peaceful rhythm. It had been 2 weeks since the attack. 2 weeks since the night she watched violence and grace coexist in the same man. 2 weeks since she stopped believing she was alone. In that short time, Eli Carson had become a quiet, constant rhythm in her life. He never spoke much, never filled silence with words. But when he was there, the silence felt like safety, not emptiness. Now, as the sun climbed over the water, that silence was unbearable. Ranger stirred, sensing her unease. She knelt and ran her fingers through his fur. "He's leaving today," she whispered. "Back to wherever soldiers go when they've done too much saving." The dog thumped his tail once, a small sound of trust. Grace smiled faintly. "Yeah, I know. He'll come back. Maybe." A knock came at the door, soft, measured, unmistakably him. She rose, pulling the blanket tighter. When she opened the door, Eli stood there in clean fatigues, duffel over his shoulder. His hair was damp from the shower, his face freshly shaven. Only his eyes, those quiet gray eyes, betrayed any weight. "Morning," he said. "Morning." They looked at each other for a long moment, neither moving. Then he glanced past her shoulder to the balcony. "Ranger doing better?" "He's walking again," she said. "Still hates thunder, though." "He's got good instincts. Knows when to be cautious." "So do you," she said softly. Eli's smile was brief, almost wistful. "Occupational hazard." He set the duffel by the door and handed her a small envelope. "Vet bills fully paid. I left Dr. Ortiz a number in case she needs follow-up scans." Grace frowned. "You didn't have to." "I know." He turned toward the window, watching the morning fog curl off the river. "My flight's in 2 hours. I wanted to say goodbye properly this time." Her throat tightened. "Properly," she repeated, as if the word itself might break. He turned back to her. "You did something for me, Grace. You reminded me what peace looks like." "That doesn't sound like peace," she whispered. "That sounds like goodbye." Eli's voice gentled. "Sometimes they're the same thing." The words hung between them, fragile and heavy. She wanted to tell him that he had given her back the will to live, that his quiet strength had mended something her husband's death had left shattered. But instead, she said the smallest truth she could manage. "You saved me." He shook his head. "No, you saved yourself. I just stood nearby." Ranger came padding out from the balcony, limping slightly, tail wagging. Eli crouched, his big hands gentle as he scratched behind the dog's ear. "You keep her safe, buddy. That's your mission now." The dog licked his hand once, a low whine rumbling in his throat. Grace felt her chest ache. "He never does that with anyone but me." Eli glanced up, eyes glinting with quiet amusement. "Then I guess I'm in good company." For a while, none of them moved. The morning light spilled across the floorboards, gilding everything it touched. When Eli finally stood, Grace took a slow breath. "Where will you go?" He hesitated. "There's a program in Montana, training canine units for veterans with PTSD. They could use someone who understands both sides of the leash." Her smile flickered. "That sounds like you." "Maybe it's a way to balance the scales." She looked down at her hands. "Will you come back?" Eli didn't answer immediately. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small metal tag, worn smooth by time. He pressed it into her palm. It was an Old Navy dog tag, edges dulled, numbers nearly unreadable. "If you ever need me," he said quietly, "just mail a letter to this address on the back. No one else knows it." Grace closed her fingers around the tag as though it were a heartbeat. "You're giving me part of yourself." "Borrowing," he corrected gently. "I plan on getting it back." Something inside her broke, not from pain, but from the sheer weight of tenderness. "Eli, I don't want you to go." He stepped closer, the air between them humming with everything left unsaid. "You don't need me here to be safe anymore." "That's not what I meant." He searched her face, the soldier in him fighting the man beneath. And then, slowly, he reached up and brushed a strand of hair from her cheek. "You're stronger than you think, Grace. I just reminded you how to stand again." Her eyes filled, her voice trembling. "And what about you? Who reminds you?" For a long moment, he didn't speak. Then he leaned forward, his forehead resting lightly against hers. "You already did." The touch was fleeting but infinite, like the first breath after surfacing from deep water. When he pulled away, the silence felt sacred. He picked up his duffel. "Take care of yourself." She nodded, unable to find words. He was halfway down the hall when she found her voice again. "Eli," he turned. "Will I see you again?" For the first time, he smiled, a real, unguarded smile that reached his eyes. "If the world's kind, yeah. And if not, I'll find my way back anyway." Then he was gone. Grace stood in the doorway long after the elevator doors closed, the tag warm in her hand. Outside, the city began to wake, the sound of a streetcar bell, the chatter of sparrows in the dripping trees. She went back to the balcony, Ranger, following, and watched the sky brighten over the river. She whispered to the wind, "You'll come back." And though the air carried no answer, something inside her already knew. Eli's flight lifted off just after 9. He sat by the window, watching the clouds part below. The landscape unfurled like a painting, silver rivers winding through green fields, small towns vanishing into morning haze. He reached into his jacket pocket, pulling out a single object, the photo Grace had left on her table, tucked halfway beneath his coffee mug. It showed her husband, smiling beside a much younger Grace, sunlight catching her hair. On the back, in her looping handwriting, were just 3 words. For your peace. He closed his eyes and leaned back, the roar of the engines fading into something gentler. For the first time since leaving the service, his heartbeat didn't sound like marching boots. It sounded like home. Weeks later, the Savannah Community Center reopened its main hall. The Taekwondo studio had a new instructor, calm, patient, the kind who taught respect before power. Grace had returned to nursing part-time, working with the city's animal rescue clinic on weekends. Ranger, ribs fully healed, wore a bright blue harness that said "Therapy Dog in Training." Some evenings, as the sun dipped low and the river turned to molten copper, she would sit on her balcony with a cup of tea, the old dog tag cool against her neck. She'd trace the worn letters with her thumb and whisper to herself, "He'll keep his promise." And somewhere far north, in a wide Montana valley where the mountains caught the sunrise like a hymn, Eli Carson stood in a field surrounded by German shepherds in training. The wind carried the smell of pine and dust and something almost holy. He smiled faintly, a quiet man in a world that was loud again. "Good work, team," he murmured to the dogs. One shepherd, tall and strong, nudged his hand with a familiar look, eyes amber like the Georgia sun. Eli chuckled, rubbing its head. "You remind me of someone," he said. "Brave as they come." As the light faded behind the mountains, he looked east toward Savannah. The horizon glowed faintly pink, and he thought of a woman with auburn hair and a dog with healing scars. He whispered to the wind, "I'll come home soon." And though no one heard it but the trees, the promise lingered in the quiet, like a prayer that refused to die. And so, in the quiet streets of Savannah, 2 broken souls found healing. Not through grand miracles, but through simple acts of courage, compassion, and faith. Eli learned that strength is not in the fight, but in the protection of what is gentle. Grace discovered that even after loss, love can return. Different, quieter, but still whole. And Ranger, the dog, once beaten and afraid, became a symbol of hope. A reminder that loyalty, once wounded, can still be reborn. If this story touched your heart, please help us keep these messages of kindness and faith alive. Like, share, and subscribe to our channel, so more people can feel the warmth of stories where love wins, even in the darkest nights. Your comments below remind us that we are not alone in believing that goodness still exists. May God bless you and your family. May He protect your home, your heart, and every soul you love. Because even in the hardest times, miracles still happen. Through people, through faith, and through love. Amen.